The morning air carried that distinctive Rocky Mountain crispness, sharp enough to jolt the senses yet somehow soothing in its purity. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold as the first rays of sunlight crested the jagged peaks. Ponderosa pines stood like silent sentinels across the sloping terrain, their needles glistening with dew. It was early June, that perfect interval when winter's grip had finally loosened, yet summer tourists hadn't arrived in full force. The tourist checked his backpack one final time before leaving the comfort of his rented cabin. At 48, he'd developed an almost ritualistic approach to these annual solo excursions. 20 years of exploring national parks and wilderness areas had taught him the value of preparation. He meticulously packed his essentials: water bottles, trail mix, compass, first aid kit, camera, and the detailed topographical map he'd purchased from the visitor center the previous evening. There was something different about today's excursion, a subtle resistance he couldn't quite name. Back home, he managed a successful marketing firm, overseeing 30 employees and navigating corporate challenges with practiced ease. His colleagues viewed him as unflappable, the steady hand during turbulent times. Yet these annual retreats into nature had become increasingly necessary as the years progressed. The divorce 3 years ago had left emotional terrain still tender to navigate, though the weekly video calls with his teenage children provided anchoring points of joy. The tourist pulled his weathered hiking boots over thick wool socks, a habit ingrained from years of outdoor experience. His hands, once soft from office work but now bearing the subtle calluses of a weekend warrior, worked the laces into double knots. The cabin rental company had recommended several well-traveled routes, but something in him yearned for a path less trodden. He'd noticed a faint trail on his map, one that veered away from the popular viewpoints and followed what appeared to be an old service road before branching deeper into a relatively isolated section of the mountains. As he stepped onto the porch, the tourist breathed deeply, filling his lungs with crisp mountain air scented with pine and juniper. The morning silence struck him immediately. No birds calling, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. His experienced instincts flagged this absence of natural sound, but he dismissed it as an odd peculiarity of this particular mountain valley. The sky above presented a perfect azure canvas, not a cloud in sight. Weather reports promised ideal hiking conditions, though in these mountains, meteorological predictions were always taken as loose suggestions rather than guarantees. His phone showed no service, exactly as expected and, truthfully, preferred. These disconnected days were precious, allowing his mind to untether from emails, notifications, and the constant digital tug of modern existence. His rental Jeep handled the winding Forest Service road with confidence, carrying him to the small, unmarked trailhead he'd identified. The tourist parked in a small clearing, double-checking the coordinates on his GPS unit before tucking it into a side pocket. According to his calculations, the loop he planned would take approximately 5 hours, returning him to this spot by mid-afternoon. The first mile passed pleasantly enough, the trail alternating between gentle inclines and level stretches that wound between towering pines and occasional aspen groves. Yet something felt increasingly off-kilter. Twice he spotted deer, not unusual in itself, but they seemed unnaturally alert, muscles tensed as if poised between flight and freeze. When the tourist paused to photograph a particularly striking view, he noticed the animals staring not at him, but toward a ridge in the distance. Nearly 2 hours into his hike, the tourist reached a natural overlook. Below stretched a valley he hadn't expected, not marked clearly on his map, but unmistakably present. The morning mist still clung to the lowest points, creating an ethereal landscape that seemed plucked from a fantasy novel. He removed his pack, retrieved his water bottle, and settled on a flat boulder to appreciate the view. The silence had grown more profound the further he'd traveled from the road. No aircraft overhead, no distant voices of other hikers, not even the sound of running water, though the map indicated a creek nearby. The tourist's 20 years of outdoor experience had taught him to read landscapes, and something about this valley's stillness raised the fine hairs at his nape. It wasn't just quiet, it felt abandoned, as if even the wildlife had collectively decided to avoid this particular hollow. After consulting his map again, the tourist decided to adjust his route. Rather than continuing along the ridgeline as originally planned, he would descend into the valley below. The tourist couldn't articulate why exactly, perhaps simple curiosity, Or maybe that inexplicable pull that sometimes guides explorers toward the unknown. His professional life demanded logic and analysis, but out here, he allowed instinct greater latitude. The descent required careful footing as the trail grew steeper and less defined. In spots, he had to navigate loose shale that shifted treacherously underfoot. The tourist used his hiking poles for balance, planting them firmly with each step. As he moved deeper into the valley, the temperature dropped noticeably, despite the climbing morning sun. The cold felt somehow different, not the typical mountain coolness, but something more penetrating. The tree canopy thickened as he reached the valley floor, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of shadow and light. Here, finally, he heard sounds. A squirrel chattering anxiously overhead, the soft rustle of wind through pine needles. Yet rather than providing comfort, these isolated noises only heightened the surrounding quiet, like sporadic notes that emphasized the silence between them. The tourist checked his watch. 11:20 a.m. He'd been hiking for just over 3 hours, making good time despite the unplanned detour. According to his map, he should reconnect with the main trail in another mile or so. But first, he would allow himself a proper lunch break. He began scouting for a suitable spot, preferably near the creek marked on his map. The creek proved more difficult to locate than anticipated. The tourist followed what should have been its course according to his topographical map, yet found only a dry stream bed littered with smooth stones, evidence of water that no longer flowed. This inconsistency troubled him. The map wasn't old, purchased just yesterday from the visitor center, and spring runoff should have ensured at least a modest current this time of year. He followed the dry creek bed, reasoning that it might lead to something of interest. The path wound through increasingly dense foliage, requiring him to occasionally duck under low-hanging branches or push aside thick underbrush. The forest here felt unnaturally compressed, trees growing closer together than seemed natural, creating corridors of vegetation that channeled his movement in ways that felt almost deliberate. After 20 minutes of this labyrinthine progress, the tourist emerged into a small clearing. The sudden transition from dense forest to open space momentarily disoriented him. As his vision adjusted, he registered what stood approximately 50 yards ahead, a cabin. The structure appeared suddenly, as if it had materialized between one blink and the next. The tourist's first thought was that he'd somehow circled back to the recreation area, but a quick check of his GPS confirmed he was miles from any marked structure. This cabin stood isolated, apparently forgotten by both maps and memory. The building itself was modest, a single-story structure constructed from roughly hewn logs, darkened by exposure to countless seasons. A small covered porch extended from the front, its roof sagging noticeably on the left side. No smoke rose from the stone chimney, and the 2 visible windows reflected only darkness behind glass clouded by years of accumulated grime. The surrounding clearing contained no garden, no outbuildings, no vehicle, just overgrown grass and the occasional sapling beginning to reclaim the space for the forest. The tourist stood motionless, cataloging details with the practiced eye of someone who'd explored dozens of historical sites across the country. The cabin's construction style suggested late 19th or early 20th century, typical of mining claims or early homesteads in the Colorado mountains. Yet something about its preservation seemed wrong. Despite obvious neglect, the cabin showed remarkably little structural decay for what must have been decades of abandonment. Professional curiosity gradually overcame his initial caution. The tourist approached slowly, alert for any sign of recent human activity. No footprints disturbed the soft earth around the structure. No freshly cut wood or modern additions suggested renovation work. Even the path leading to the front door had nearly disappeared beneath encroaching vegetation. His heartbeat quickened as he ascended the 3 wooden steps to the porch. Each creaked beneath his weight, the sound shocking in the pervasive silence. The tourist paused at the top, giving his eyes time to adjust to the shadow beneath the porch roof. A vintage metal sign hung beside the door, its lettering too rusted and faded to decipher. The door itself stood slightly ajar, not wide enough to see inside, but enough to indicate it wasn't locked. 20 years of exploring historical sites had taught the tourist respect for private property. Typically, he would never enter a structure without permission, regardless of its apparent abandonment. Yet something about this cabin, its absence from all maps, its isolation, its peculiar state of preservation, suggested it had slipped through bureaucratic cracks, belonging to neither Park Service nor private citizen. The tourist called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" His voice sounded thin and weak, quickly swallowed by the surrounding forest. No response came, not even an echo. After waiting a respectful interval, he placed his hand against the weathered door. The wood felt unnaturally cold beneath his palm, colder than ambient air temperature could explain. The tourist pushed gently, and the door swung inward with surprising ease, hinges silent despite their apparent age. Natural caution made him hesitate at the threshold. The interior lay in shadow, illuminated only by the narrow shaft of sunlight now streaming through the open doorway. The tourist reached for his flashlight, clicked it on, and directed the beam into the cabin's interior. His body reacted before his mind could process what he was seeing. The tourist's muscles locked involuntarily, his breath catching sharply in his throat. The flashlight beam trembled as his hand began to shake. A cold sweat erupted across his skin despite the chill air, and his pulse hammered so violently he could feel it throbbing in his temples. The interior of the cabin contained a scene so incongruous, so utterly unexpected, that his brain initially refused to assemble the visual information into coherent meaning. The single room was meticulously organized, not with furniture, but with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of photographs pinned to every available surface. They covered the walls completely, overlapping like scales. They carpeted the floor in precise rows. They hung from the ceiling on strings, twisting slowly in the subtle air current created by the open door. Each photograph showed the same subject, this exact cabin, captured from identical angles, across what appeared to be different decades. The tourist's flashlight beam darted from image to image, revealing a chronological progression. Early photos in sepia tones, later ones in black and white, color photographs from what appeared to be the 1970s and 80s, digital prints from more recent years. The quality and technology evolved, but the subject never varied. Always this cabin, always from the same 5 or 6 vantage points. But it was what appeared in the later photographs that caused the tourist's blood to crystallize in his veins. Beginning in what appeared to be the early 2000s, the photographs began to capture something else. Shadowy figures standing at increasing proximity to the cabin. In the most recent images, dated just weeks earlier, the figures stood directly before the door, their features blurred beyond recognition, as if the camera had failed to properly focus despite capturing the cabin itself with perfect clarity. In the exact center of the room stood a tripod with a camera, the exact model the tourist carried in his own backpack. Next to it lay a single photograph, larger than the others, placed precisely on a small wooden table. From his position at the doorway, the tourist couldn't make out its contents. Time seemed suspended as the tourist stood frozen, unable to retreat, equally unable to step fully into the room. His professional experience, 20 years of exploring remote locations, had never prepared him for anything like this. His rational mind scrambled for explanations, an elaborate art installation, perhaps, or the work of a disturbed individual with an obsession for historical documentation. Yet these explanations withered against the overwhelming wrongness that emanated from the display, the absolute silence of the cabin, the impossible chronological span of the photographs, the methodical, almost ritualistic arrangement, the shadowy figures growing closer in each successive image. When he finally managed to move, the tourist stumbled backward so quickly he nearly fell from the porch. His hiking boot caught on a loose board, sending him lurching against the railing, which held firm despite its weathered appearance. The sound of his own ragged breathing seemed thunderous after the unnatural quiet of the cabin's interior. The tourist retreated to the tree line, putting a safe distance between himself and the cabin while keeping the structure in view. His hands trembled as he unzipped his backpack and retrieved his water bottle, the simple action requiring unusual concentration. The water tasted metallic on his tongue, doing little to wash away the dryness in his throat. 20 minutes passed as he sat with his back against a broad pine trunk, wrestling his thoughts into order. Professional curiosity gradually reasserted itself against primal fear. The marketer in him, the analyst who built his career on understanding patterns and motivations, couldn't leave this mystery unexplored. Whatever waited inside that cabin represented something unprecedented, something that demanded documentation. The tourist's digital camera remained in his backpack, untouched since his earlier landscape photographs. He extracted it now, checking the battery level, nearly full, and the remaining storage capacity, sufficient for hundreds of high-resolution images. If he couldn't bring himself to re-enter the cabin immediately, he could at least document its exterior. Moving methodically around the perimeter, he captured the structure from multiple angles, paying particular attention to architectural details and signs of age. The cabin's construction appeared consistent with late 19th century techniques: hand-hewn logs with dovetail notching, a fieldstone chimney, manually split cedar shingles. Yet inconsistencies emerged upon closer inspection. No moss grew on the north-facing walls. No bird nests occupied the eaves. The tourist had explored enough historical structures to recognize these absences as unnatural. The windows, though grimy, remained unbroken, another anomaly for an abandoned structure in wilderness. Through their clouded glass, he could make out only vague shapes of the photograph-covered interior. The tourist used his telephoto lens to capture these glimpses, his hand steadier now as professional focus replaced emotional reaction. After completing his exterior documentation, the tourist settled on a fallen log and reviewed the images on his camera's LCD screen. The photographs appeared normal in most respects: proper exposure, accurate color rendition, expected detail. Yet something about the cabin's proportions seemed subtly wrong, as if the structure existed slightly out of alignment with natural geometry. The tourist checked his watch. 2:45 p.m. Hours of daylight remained, but the thought of being near this place after sunset sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with temperature. He needed to report this discovery, but to whom? The visitor center seemed the logical starting point, yet intuition suggested this situation required more specialized attention. From his backpack, the tourist retrieved the Park Service brochure he'd collected upon arrival. The contact information listed rangers' office hours and an emergency number. This didn't qualify as a traditional emergency, yet the unsettling nature of the discovery warranted prompt reporting. With no cell service available, the tourist would need to return to the main road before contacting authorities. He marked the cabin's coordinates on his GPS unit, verified his current location relative to the trail, and packed his equipment with methodical care. Something made him hesitate, however, before leaving: the sense that he might never find this place again if he departed now. Against every instinct urging retreat, the tourist forced himself to approach the cabin once more. This time, he left his backpack at a safe distance, carrying only his camera and a small notebook. At the threshold, he paused again, listening for any sound from within. The silence remained absolute. The door stood exactly as he'd left it, partially open, revealing a slice of the photograph-covered interior. The tourist raised his camera and took several flash photographs through the doorway, unwilling to physically re-enter the space. The flash illuminated details previously hidden in shadow: a small wood stove in the corner, covered in photographs like everything else, a ladder leading to what appeared to be a sleeping loft, a collection of empty glass jars arranged in a perfect circle on the floor. Most notably, the flash revealed the contents of the large photograph on the central table, a clear image of the tourist himself, standing exactly where he was now, taking this very picture. The impossibility struck him like a physical blow, sending him stumbling backward down the porch steps. The tourist's retreat to the tree line happened without conscious thought, his body operating on pure survival instinct. His hands fumbled with the camera, pulling up the image he'd just captured. There on the LCD screen, clearly visible despite the distance, was the photograph on the table, showing him in this moment from an angle that could only have been captured from inside the cabin. This final impossibility broke something in the tourist's methodical approach. He grabbed his backpack and began moving rapidly along the creek bed, retracing his route toward the trailhead. Only when he'd put a quarter-mile between himself and the clearing did his pace slow enough for rational thought to resume. The tourist needed evidence beyond his own photographs and testimony. He needed verification from authorities, experts who could explain the inexplicable or at least document it properly. The nearest ranger station was approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, a 15-minute drive once he reached his vehicle. By the time the tourist arrived at the modest ranger station, the afternoon sun had begun its westward descent. A single official vehicle sat in the small parking area, a promising sign that someone remained on duty. The building itself was typical of rural Park Service outposts: a log structure with green metal roof, American flag fluttering from a pole near the entrance, informational posters visible through the windows. The tourist entered to find a single ranger at the desk, a woman in her late 50s with sun-weathered skin and attentive eyes that assessed him immediately. Her name tag identified her simply as Senior Ranger, no personal name displayed. The tourist noted this unusual anonymity, but was too focused on his purpose to question it. "I need to report something unusual I found while hiking," he began, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Unusual in what way, sir?" The ranger's tone remained professionally neutral, though something in her expression suggested she'd catalogued his agitated state. The tourist described the cabin's location, its absence from official maps, and the disturbing photographic display within. He intentionally omitted the impossible self-portrait, concerned it might undermine his credibility. As he spoke, the ranger made occasional notes on a standard incident form, but offered no comments or questions. When he finished his account, the ranger's response proved anticlimactic. "We'll look into it when resources permit. This area has numerous unregistered historical structures. Most are scheduled for evaluation, but backlogged due to staffing limitations." "You don't understand," the tourist pressed, pulling out his camera. "This isn't just an abandoned building. Something's wrong there." The ranger held up a hand, declining to view his photographs. "Sir, unauthorized structures are documented according to established protocols. If you've encountered evidence of illegal activity, that would warrant immediate investigation. Otherwise, we add it to our assessment queue." The tourist recognized the bureaucratic stonewalling for what it was, the automatic response of an overworked system to what sounded like a low-priority concern. He tried another approach. "Could this structure be on private property? Maybe there's an owner I could contact." "Unlikely," the ranger replied, her tone softening slightly at his persistence. "Most inholdings were acquired decades ago, but I can check the registry if you provide exact coordinates." The tourist supplied the information from his GPS unit, watching as the ranger input the numbers into her computer. After a moment, she shook her head. "Nothing in our database at that location. The nearest registered structure is over 3 miles southeast, the Henderson Historical Mining Cabin, which is properly marked and maintained." The conversation continued in this vein for another 10 minutes, yielding nothing but promises to file a report and notify the appropriate department. The tourist left the ranger station with a carbon copy of the incident form and a growing certainty that no official action would follow. Back in his rental car, the tourist sat motionless, hands resting on the steering wheel. The rational part of his mind, the successful businessman who built a career on logical analysis, urged him to let this go, drive back to his rental cabin, pack his belongings, return to the city tomorrow as planned. Yet something deeper overrode these sensible impulses. The photographs, the chronological progression, the shadowy figures growing closer with each image, and most disturbingly, the impossible self-portrait that could not exist yet somehow did. These elements formed a puzzle his mind couldn't release, a mystery that demanded resolution, despite every instinct warning against further involvement. The tourist started the engine but didn't immediately drive toward his rental cabin. Instead, he pulled out his laptop and connected it to the camera, transferring the day's images for closer examination on the larger screen. The late afternoon sun slanted through the car windows as he scrutinized each photograph of the cabin, looking for details he might have missed, for any rational explanation that might dispel the growing dread in his gut. As darkness began to gather around the parked vehicle, the tourist reached a decision. The authorities had proven unhelpful. The mystery would remain unsolved unless he took more direct action. Tomorrow, instead of departing as scheduled, he would return to the cabin, better equipped, better prepared, determined to document everything thoroughly enough to compel official attention. The drive back to his rental cabin passed in a blur of preoccupation. The tourist stopped briefly at a general store, purchasing additional batteries, a more powerful flashlight, and a canister of bear spray, the latter providing some small comfort, though he suspected whatever waited in that cabin wouldn't be deterred by capsaicin. That night, sleep proved elusive. The tourist lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, mind cycling through possible explanations for what he'd discovered: art installation, psychological experiment, elaborate hoax. Each theory collapsed under the weight of the cabin's isolation and the impossibility of the self-portrait. Around 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally pulled him under, but his dreams were fragmented, filled with endlessly twisting corridors lined with photographs, all showing the same cabin from slightly different angles across a century of time. Dawn arrived with a muted quality, as if the mountains themselves filtered the sunlight to a softer hue. The tourist had managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful sleep, waking repeatedly from dreams saturated with imagery of the cabin and its impossible photographs. He rose at 5:30 a.m., mechanically preparing coffee in the small kitchenette of his rental cabin. his mind already mapping out the day's investigation. Yesterday's disturbing discovery demanded context, historical, geographical, perhaps even geological. If the local Park Service wouldn't provide immediate assistance, he would need to gather information independently. The tourist's professional instincts, honed through 2 decades of market analysis and pattern recognition, suggested that nothing exists in complete isolation. Every anomaly connects to something larger, if only one knows where to look. After a quick breakfast, the tourist packed his laptop and drove to the nearest town, a modest settlement of perhaps 2,000 residents that served primarily as a gateway community to the surrounding wilderness. Despite its small size, the town maintained the essential infrastructure of rural American life: a grocery store, gas station, medical clinic, and, crucially for his purposes, a regional library housed in a century-old brick building near the town square. The library wouldn't open until 9, giving the tourist nearly an hour to kill. He spent this time at a local diner, nursing a second cup of coffee while discreetly observing the morning routines of year-round residents. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a practical bun, moved efficiently between tables, exchanging familiar greetings with customers who clearly visited daily. The tourist caught fragments of conversation: weather predictions, fishing conditions, someone's granddaughter starting college, the mundane tapestry of small-town life continuing undisturbed by whatever waited in those mountains. At precisely 9 a.m., the tourist entered the library, immediately noting the stark contrast between its historical exterior and modernized interior. Computer workstations lined one wall, while comfortable reading areas occupied spaces between well-organized shelves. A circulation desk dominated the center of the main room, staffed by a librarian who appeared to be in her mid-40s, with reading glasses suspended from a beaded chain around her neck. "Good morning," the tourist greeted her, deliberately projecting casual interest rather than the urgency he felt. "I'm doing some research on historical structures in the area. Would you happen to have local archives or county records I could access?" The librarian assessed him with the quick, evaluative glance of someone accustomed to categorizing visitors. "The main county records are kept at the administrative building 3 blocks south," she explained, "but we maintain digital copies of most historical documents here. We also have the Regional Historical Society's collection. What specific period or area are you researching?" The tourist considered his response carefully. "I'm interested in remote structures in the northwestern valley area, particularly anything from the late 19th or early 20th century. Mining cabins, homesteads, that sort of thing." "Northwestern Valley?" The librarian's expression shifted subtly. "That would be Blackwater Valley, most likely. Not much documented settlement there, but we do have some materials. The Historical Society digitized most of their archives 3 years ago. I can set you up at a research terminal." The term Blackwater Valley registered immediately. The tourist hadn't encountered this designation on any of his maps, including the detailed topographical chart purchased at the visitor center. He followed the librarian to a computer station in a quiet corner, watching as she logged into a specialized database and entered several search parameters. "This will give you access to everything we have on that region," she explained, stepping back from the terminal. "The system's fairly intuitive. If you need help with anything specific, just let me know." "One question," the tourist said as the librarian turned to leave. "Is there any particular reason Blackwater Valley isn't marked on most current maps?" The librarian paused, her fingers unconsciously adjusting her glasses. "Official designation changed in the 1960s after the conservation area was established. Modern maps list it under the recreation area name instead. Locals still use the old term." The tourist thanked her and turned his attention to the database, detecting something not quite convincing in her explanation but unwilling to press further. The search interface displayed an organized collection of digitized documents: land surveys, property records, newspaper clippings, and historical photographs, all neatly categorized by date and relevance to specific locations within the county. He began with the earliest records, methodically working forward through time. The initial settlement of Blackwater Valley appeared to follow a typical Western development pattern: isolated trappers' cabins in the 1850s, followed by prospectors during a minor silver strike in the 1870s, then scattered homesteads established under various land claim acts. Nothing particularly unusual emerged until he reached documents from 1897. A newspaper clipping from September of that year described the establishment of a research station in the valley by something called the Western Geographical Society. an organization unfamiliar to the tourist despite his extensive reading on American frontier history. The article remained frustratingly vague about the station's purpose, mentioning only advanced scientific studies and atmospheric documentation. Cross-referencing this information with land records revealed a formal purchase of 80 acres in the northwestern section of Blackwater Valley, coordinates that roughly matched the location of the cabin he'd discovered. The transaction listed the buyer as Western Geographical Society, Denver office, with no individual names attached. Property tax records showed regular payments until 1954, after which the property disappeared from official documentation entirely. The tourist's pulse quickened as he located several photographs labeled Western Geographical Society Station, 1899-1901. The images showed a compound significantly larger than the single cabin he'd encountered, a main building resembling the structure he'd found, plus 3 additional outbuildings arranged in a rough quadrangle around a central courtyard. Men in late Victorian attire stood posed before the buildings, their faces deliberately turned away from the camera, an unusual choice for period photography when subjects typically faced forward with solemn expressions. More troubling was a technical report dated 1903, detailing equipment installed at the station. The language employed technical terminology unfamiliar to the tourist, with repeated references to temporal anomaly measurements and chronological displacement observations. The document included detailed schematics for instruments that resembled no scientific equipment from that era that the tourist could recognize, despite his layman's knowledge of historical technology. The tourist's investigation continued for nearly 3 hours, piecing together fragments of the station's history. The most recent reference appeared in a 1962 government memorandum regarding the establishment of the current recreation area, which mentioned previous research installations being decommissioned and sealed as part of the land conversion process. A handwritten note in the margin, barely visible in the digital scan, read, "Confirm full documentation removal before public access." As the tourist compiled notes and downloaded key documents to his laptop, the librarian approached his terminal. "Finding what you need?" she inquired, her tone pleasant yet somehow guarded. "Yes, thank you," the tourist replied, maintaining his cover of casual academic interest. "I'm particularly interested in this Western Geographical Society. Were they affiliated with a university or government agency?" The librarian's expression remained neutral, but a subtle tension appeared around her eyes. "I couldn't say with any certainty. Many scientific organizations operated in this region during that period. The Historical Society might have more specific information, but their office is only open on Tuesdays and Thursdays." The tourist nodded, noting that today was Monday, a convenient timing that prevented immediate follow-up with what might be a more knowledgeable source. "One more question," he ventured. "The original compound had multiple buildings according to these photographs, but I understand most structures were removed when the recreation area was established. Would there be records of exactly what was dismantled versus preserved? The Forest Service would maintain those records," the librarian answered, her response coming perhaps too quickly. "Their district office is in Glenwood Springs, about 90 minutes from here." The tourist thanked her again and returned to his research, sensing her lingering presence for several seconds before she moved away to assist another patron. He continued downloading documents for another 20 minutes, then logged out of the terminal and exited the library, feeling the librarian's gaze following him to the door. Outside, the tourist checked his watch, nearly 1 p.m. The county administrative building would likely maintain regular business hours until 4 or 5 Mahurliu, giving him ample time to continue his investigation. He walked the 3 blocks south, entering a 1970s-era concrete structure that contrasted sharply with the town's otherwise historical aesthetic. The county records office occupied the building's 2nd floor, a fluorescent-lit space with beige walls and industrial carpeting that had seen better decades. A single clerk manned the reception counter, a man in his 30s with the resigned expression of someone whose career involved endless paper processing. A nameplate on his desk identified him only as records technician. "I'm researching historical property records for the Northwestern Recreation Area," the tourist explained after exchanging perfunctory greetings. "Specifically, I'm interested in anything related to structures that predated the conservation designation." The clerk's response lacked the subtle guardedness the tourist had detected in the librarian. "Most of those records were digitized in 2018, he explained, tapping at his computer keyboard. but we still have the original plat books and survey maps in the back room. Any specific property you're looking for? A research station operated by the Western Geographical Society, active from approximately 1897 to the 1950s. The clerk's fingers paused momentarily over the keyboard, a brief hesitation that might have gone unnoticed by someone less attuned to subtle reactions. Let me see what we have in the system. After several minutes of searching, the clerk frowned at his monitor. That's odd. I'm finding property tax records up to 1954, then nothing. Usually there would be a transfer of deed, a lien, or some documentation of disposition. Let me check the physical archives. The tourist waited as the clerk disappeared into a back room, returning 10 minutes later with a large leather-bound volume and several rolled survey maps. These are the original county surveys from 1880 through 1920, the clerk explained, spreading one map across the counter. And this ledger contains handwritten property transactions for the same period. Together they examined the materials, the clerk displaying genuine professional interest in the apparent record-keeping anomaly. The survey map clearly showed the Western Geographical Society compound in its complete form. 4 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, plus what appeared to be a small observatory structure on a nearby ridge. The property boundaries encompassed approximately 80 acres of valley land, plus the adjacent ridge. The ledger confirmed the original purchase but contained an unexpected addendum dated 1915. Property designated under Special Scientific Reservation by Federal Executive Order 1897C. County Jurisdiction Limited. See Restricted Federal Records. I've never seen this designation before, the clerk admitted, studying the faded handwriting. Special Scientific Reservation isn't a standard land classification from that period. The tourist photographed the relevant pages with his phone, capturing both the survey map and ledger entries. Would the county have any record of what happened when the recreation area was established? Specifically, documentation of which structures were removed versus preserved? The clerk shook his head. That would have been a federal action, not county. Local government wouldn't necessarily have been involved in those decisions. He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "But between us, there's always been something strange about how that recreation area was established. My grandfather worked for the county roads department back then, and he mentioned crews being turned away from certain areas during the transition. Federal agents on site, unusual restrictions." This voluntary offering of information struck the tourist as significant, the first instance of someone providing additional context rather than deflecting his inquiries. "Were there any local news stories about it at the time?" he asked. "Not that I've ever seen," which itself is strange for a small town where road closures typically make front-page news. The clerk glanced toward the office's open door, then continued quietly, "You might want to check with the retired forest ranger who lives out on County Road 23. Harrison was his name, I think. He worked this district during that transition period. If anyone would know what actually happened out there, it would be him." The tourist nodded, committing the name and location to memory, the first proper name he'd encountered in his investigation, a potential breakthrough. "Thank you for your help. You've been extraordinarily thorough." "Just doing my job," the clerk replied, returning to his professional demeanor as another customer entered the office. "Good luck with your research." Before leaving town, the tourist made one additional stop, a small surveyor's office he'd noticed earlier, located in a converted Victorian house near the main street. The business appeared to be a long-established local operation, as evidenced by the weathered sign advertising Mountain Vista Surveying, serving the county since 1973. Inside, he found a reception area decorated with topographical maps and aerial photographs of the surrounding region. The receptionist, a woman in her 20s with a practical ponytail and outdoor weathered complexion, greeted him with the casual friendliness characteristic of small mountain towns. "I'm doing research on historical structures in the northwestern recreation area," the tourist explained, maintaining his academic cover. "I'm particularly interested in accurate coordinates for some buildings that may no longer appear on standard maps. Most of our work is current property surveys," the receptionist explained, "but the owner has been surveying this region for nearly 50 years. He might have historical information. Let me check if he's available." Moments later, the tourist was ushered into a cluttered back office where the surveyor, a man in his 70s with white hair and sun-leathered skin, sat surrounded by maps and technical equipment. After explaining his interest in the Western Geographical Society compound, the tourist showed the surveyor the historical map he'd photographed at the county office. The surveyor studied the image with professional interest. "This location would be in what we now call the North Ridge Restricted Zone. he observed, reaching for a modern topographical map on a nearby shelf. It's been designated off-limits to regular recreational use since the conservation area was established. Officially for wildlife protection, though there's never been any particularly endangered species documented there. He spread the modern map across his desk, placing a finger on a section marked with subtle cross-hatching rather than the standard green of wilderness areas. Your historical compound would have been right about here. The area remains off federal maps distributed to the public, but surveyors and emergency services need accurate documentation of all zones. Is the compound still there? The tourist asked, trying to keep his tone casual despite his accelerating pulse. The surveyor's expression turned guarded. I haven't personally surveyed that section since 1991. At that time, there was a single structure remaining, plus foundations where other buildings had been removed. He hesitated, then added, I requested permission to update our survey of that zone in 2015. Permission denied. No explanation provided. The tourist felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. That seems unusual for what should be public land. More than unusual, the surveyor agreed, his voice lowering. In 50 years of working these mountains, that's the only section I've ever been formally prohibited from accessing. He studied the tourist with newfound intensity. You're not just researching historical structures, are you? The tourist considered his response carefully. I may have encountered something unusual in that area recently. I'm trying to understand what I found. The surveyor held his gaze for a long moment, then turned to a filing cabinet in the corner. After unlocking a bottom drawer with a key from his pocket, he extracted a faded manila envelope. These are photographs from my 1991 survey. I was instructed to turn over all documentation to federal authorities afterward, but I kept personal copies. Professional habit. The envelope contained a dozen 4x6 photographs showing a cabin identical to the one the tourist had discovered, though the 1991 images showed the structure in notably better condition. The surrounding clearing appeared more maintained, with clearly visible footpaths connecting to the stone foundations where additional buildings once stood. Most significantly, several images captured what appeared to be scientific equipment installed around the cabin's perimeter. Metal posts with unusual attachments that resembled neither weather instruments nor typical survey markers. Did you document what these devices were? The tourist asked, pointing to the equipment. The surveyor shook his head. Not my jurisdiction. I was there to confirm property boundaries, not inventory contents. He reclaimed the photographs, returning them to the envelope. Whatever's out there, it's been of interest to someone with enough authority to maintain special classification for over 60 years. That's not typical land management. That's something else entirely. As the tourist prepared to leave, the surveyor offered one final observation. The equipment I saw in 1991, it wasn't historical. It was modern technology, actively maintained. Someone was still conducting some kind of operation out there, long after the supposed decommissioning in the 1960s. By mid-afternoon, the tourist had returned to his rental cabin to prepare for a second expedition to the mysterious structure. His morning research had transformed what began as unsettling curiosity into something more focused, a mystery with historical depth and apparent institutional concealment. His professional experience had trained him to recognize patterns in seemingly disconnected data points, and every instinct told him he'd stumbled upon something deliberately hidden from public awareness. The tourist spread his newly acquired information across the cabin's small dining table. Photographs of historical documents, coordinates from both historical and modern maps, notes from conversations with local sources. The Western Geographical Society's research station had existed officially from 1897 to the 1950s, then disappeared from public records despite at least one building remaining intact. The property had transitioned from county to federal jurisdiction under unusual circumstances, maintained as a restricted zone despite no compelling conservation rationale. Most significantly, the installation had apparently been actively maintained as recently as 1991, with modern equipment installed around the original structure. This timeline connected directly to the chronological photograph display he'd discovered inside the cabin. Images spanning from historical periods through modern times, with the most recent dated just weeks earlier. The tourist repacked his backpack with methodical care, preparing for a more thorough investigation than yesterday's shocked retreat had allowed. Extra batteries for both flashlight and camera, a portable external hard drive for backup storage of digital documentation, a small notebook for physical notes, the bear spray purchased yesterday, plus a hunting knife, practical wilderness tools that might provide some psychological comfort in the face of the inexplicable. This time he added new items: a handheld GPS unit with waypoints pre-programmed from both historical and modern coordinates, a compact pair of binoculars for surveillance before approach, and most importantly, a small digital video camera with night vision capability, purchased from the town's electronics store during his return journey. If something impossible existed in that cabin, he would document it beyond any capacity for dismissal. The tourist changed from casual hiking attire into more technical gear: moisture-wicking base layers, cargo pants with multiple pockets, a muted green field jacket that would blend with the forest environment. The outfit served practical purposes for an extended wilderness investigation, but also reflected a psychological shift from recreational tourist to deliberate investigator. He reached his vehicle by 3:30 p.m., calculating that even with a moderate hiking pace, he would reach the cabin by early evening, providing several hours of daylight for exterior investigation before potentially needing to illuminate the interior. The weather remained ideal: clear skies promising visibility until summer's late sunset around 8:30 p.m. The drive to the trailhead passed without incident, though the tourist noted 2 Forest Service vehicles parked at the ranger station. More official presence than he'd observed previously. He parked his rental Jeep in the same clearing as yesterday, but this time positioned it facing outward for a potential quick departure. Before leaving the vehicle, he used his phone to capture GPS coordinates and send them to his emergency contact, a colleague back home who wouldn't check the message for days but provided some thin connection to the outside world. The hike to the valley proceeded more efficiently now that the tourist followed a known route rather than exploring. His pace remained measured, conserving energy while maintaining awareness of his surroundings. Birds called normally from the canopy above, a notable contrast to yesterday's unnatural silence. The forest seemed to have resumed its natural rhythms, which somehow increased rather than diminished the tourist's sense of wrongness surrounding the cabin. Upon reaching the ridgeline overlook, the tourist paused to survey the valley through his binoculars. The cabin remained visible in the clearing below, appearing exactly as it had the previous day. A single structure standing in isolation, no signs of current human presence. The tourist scanned the surrounding forest carefully, searching for any indication of surveillance or activity. Finding nothing immediately suspicious, he began his descent into the valley. Rather than approaching the clearing directly, the tourist circled to approach from the opposite direction, using the forest's edge as concealment. This tactical adjustment came instinctively, a response to both his morning research and the lingering sense that the cabin represented something beyond a simple abandoned structure. From his new vantage point approximately 60 yards from the cabin, the tourist began detailed documentation. He first photographed the structure and surrounding area with his telephoto lens, capturing multiple angles without leaving the forest's protective cover. The exterior appeared unchanged from yesterday, the weather-darkened logs and sagging porch creating an image of long abandonment that his research now revealed as deliberately misleading. Next, he documented the exact coordinates with his GPS unit, confirming they matched the location indicated in the historical survey maps. He noted the presence of stone foundations where additional buildings once stood, now barely visible beneath decades of accumulated forest debris. Using the surveyor's photographs from 1991 as reference, he identified locations where scientific equipment had previously been installed, though no visible evidence remained at present. After nearly 40 minutes of remote observation, the tourist detected no movement or sign of monitoring. He advanced toward the cabin, moving deliberately while maintaining awareness of potential observation points. The forest remained quietly normal. Birds continued their evening calls. Occasional breezes stirred the pine boughs. No sense of the unnatural silence that had characterized his previous visit. The tourist circled the cabin completely before approaching the porch, documenting every exterior detail with both still photography and video. Up close, he noted inconsistencies overlooked during yesterday's shock discovery. Despite the structure's weathered appearance, the roof showed no signs of leakage or structural decay. The windows, though dirty, contained intact glass with modern weather stripping around the frames. The door hinges, despite their rusted appearance, moved silently when tested, evidence of regular maintenance disguised as neglect. Most significantly, he discovered something entirely missed during his previous visit: a small metal box mounted discreetly on the cabin's rear wall, painted to match the darkened logs. The device appeared to be a modern trail camera, the type used by wildlife researchers or hunters to capture motion-activated images. A quick inspection revealed it was actively powered, with a small green LED visible behind a protective cover. The tourist photographed this surveillance device extensively, then made a decision to leave it undisturbed. If someone monitored this location, he preferred to document that fact rather than alerting them to his awareness by disabling their equipment. He continued his exterior investigation, eventually returning to the front porch. The door remained partially ajar as he'd left it yesterday. The tourist activated his video camera, securing it to his jacket pocket to maintain a record of everything he observed. With practiced caution, he pushed the door fully open and entered the cabin. The interior remained as he remembered. Walls, ceiling, and floor covered in chronologically arranged photographs of the cabin itself. The tripod still stood in the center of the room, supporting a camera identical to his own. The large photograph on the table still displayed the impossible image of himself from yesterday, frozen in the moment of capturing the cabin's interior. This time, rather than retreating in shock, the tourist methodically documented everything. He photographed the interior from multiple angles, being careful to capture the chronological progression of the displayed images. He noted that the oldest photographs, dating from the late 1890s, showed all 4 original buildings of the compound, while later images focused exclusively on the surviving cabin as other structures disappeared. Moving carefully through the room, the tourist examined the photographs more closely, identifying equipment changes over time. Early images showed bulky mechanical devices installed around and inside the cabin. By the mid-20th century, these had been replaced with more streamlined equipment. The most recent photographs displayed modern digital sensors and what appeared to be sophisticated recording devices. The tourist's investigation revealed something not noticed during his first visit: a small trapdoor in the wooden floor, partially concealed beneath a carefully arranged display of floor-mounted photographs. He documented this discovery extensively, then carefully moved the photographs aside to examine the access point. The trapdoor featured a recessed metal handle and appeared to be regularly used, based on the worn appearance of surrounding floorboards. After several minutes of consideration, the tourist decided to open the trapdoor. He recorded video continuously as he lifted the heavy wooden panel, revealing a set of steep stairs descending into darkness. A faint hum of operating equipment rose from below, confirming his suspicion that the cabin's apparent abandonment concealed ongoing activity. The tourist activated his flashlight, illuminating a narrow stairway leading to what appeared to be a modern subterranean facility, a stark contrast to the historical cabin above. The underground space contained banks of sophisticated electronic equipment, multiple workstations with modern monitors, and walls lined with what appeared to be advanced scientific instruments. The facility hummed with active power, lights blinking on various devices, clear evidence of current operation, despite the carefully maintained illusion of abandonment above. Most disturbing was a central apparatus that dominated the underground room, a circular platform surrounded by what appeared to be camera equipment, but with configurations unlike any standard photography setup the tourist had ever encountered. Cables connected this platform to the surrounding equipment banks, creating an integrated system whose purpose he couldn't determine but which clearly represented technology far beyond typical research instrumentation. The tourist descended cautiously, documenting everything with multiple cameras. He noted that the facility appeared designed for remote operation. No personal effects, food containers, or evidence of regular human presence were visible despite the actively running equipment. Whatever operation continued here appeared to function either autonomously or with only periodic maintenance visits. A computer workstation near the central platform remained powered on, its monitor displaying what appeared to be a complex scheduling interface. The tourist photographed the screen, noting a calendar with highlighted dates, including yesterday when he had first discovered the cabin. Today's date also appeared highlighted, with a timestamp indicating 2045, approximately 2 hours from the current time. This discovery accelerated the tourist's documentation efforts. He captured comprehensive video of the entire facility, backed up all digital files to his external drive, and made handwritten notes of equipment configurations and observed details. Whatever occurred here at the scheduled time, he intended to establish a complete record before potentially needing to depart. As he completed his documentation of the main equipment area, the tourist discovered a secured door at the rear of the underground facility. Unlike the rough-hewn wooden construction of the cabin above, this barrier consisted of modern metal with an electronic access panel. Without means to bypass this security, He focused on recording its existence and specifications rather than attempting entry. The tourist checked his watch, 19:10, leaving little more than 90 minutes before whatever event the facility's schedule indicated for 2045. He ascended to the main cabin, carefully repositioning the photographs he'd moved and returning the trapdoor to its original partially concealed state. His investigation had confirmed that the seemingly abandoned historical cabin concealed something far more significant. An actively operating modern facility conducting some form of ongoing research or documentation related to the photographs displayed throughout the original structure. As the tourist exited the cabin, the lengthening evening shadows stretched across the clearing. The forest had grown quieter, transitioning toward night with the gradual cessation of daytime bird calls. He secured his documentation, primary memory card stored in a waterproof case in his inner pocket, backup drive in his backpack, physical notebook in a separate zippered compartment. The redundancy felt necessary given the significance of what he'd discovered. The tourist circled once more around the cabin, confirming nothing had changed during his interior investigation. As he completed this final exterior check, something caught his attention. A small white object pinned to a tree at the clearing's edge that definitely hadn't been there during his arrival. He approached cautiously, camera ready to document whatever he found. The object proved to be a standard business envelope secured to the pine trunk with a small hunting knife, the identical model to the one in the tourist's own backpack. The envelope bore no writing on its exterior, but clearly contained something inside. The tourist photographed it in place, then carefully removed the knife and extracted the envelope's contents. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a typed message. Your presence has been documented on multiple dates. Temporal interference protocols require immediate cessation of investigation. No further warnings will be issued. The tourist's hands remained steady as he photographed the message. Professional instincts overriding the surge of adrenaline the words triggered. The note confirmed surveillance. Someone had observed his presence and responded directly. More disturbingly, the reference to multiple dates echoed the impossible chronological photographs within the cabin, suggesting something beyond conventional monitoring. Most immediately concerning was the physical reality of the message itself. Someone had placed it while he investigated the cabin's interior. Someone who had approached silently enough to avoid detection, who carried the exact model of knife the tourist had purchased just yesterday. The implied threat combined with this demonstration of proximity created an immediate security concern. The tourist scanned the surrounding forest, seeing nothing but deepening shadows among the trees. He secured the note in his evidence collection, then began moving toward the trail, choosing a different route than his approach path. His pace remained deliberately unhurried. Running would make noise and potentially signal awareness of the threat, but he maintained continuous situational awareness, pausing regularly to listen for pursuers. Halfway back to the trailhead, the tourist stopped abruptly. His backpack felt subtly wrong against his shoulders, the weight distribution slightly altered. He removed it carefully, placing it on a fallen log for inspection. The main compartment zipper, which he distinctly remembered securing with a double pull, now stood partially open. Inside, his equipment appeared undisturbed at first glance, but closer inspection revealed sabotage. The battery compartment of his video camera stood empty, the storage card missing from his backup camera, the USB connection port on his external drive physically damaged. This discovery escalated the situation from implied to direct threat. Someone had not only approached near enough to leave a warning note, but had physically accessed and compromised his equipment while he remained in the cabin. The tourist documented this sabotage with his remaining functional camera, the primary DSLR he'd kept with him throughout the investigation, then repacked his backpack with the damaged items. By the time he reached his vehicle, twilight had deepened toward night. The tourist approached the Jeep cautiously, circling completely around it before attempting entry. No obvious tampering was visible, but he checked underneath with his flashlight before starting the engine. Only when the vehicle responded normally did he allow himself to acknowledge the tension that had built between his shoulder blades, the controlled professional fear that had accompanied him since discovering the note. The drive back to his rental cabin proceeded without incident, though the tourist remained vigilantly aware of headlights in his rearview mirror. No vehicle maintained consistent following distance, no obvious pursuit materialized, yet the sense of being monitored persisted. It was nearly 10 p.m. when he finally secured himself inside the rental, immediately checking all rooms, closets, and potential hiding places before allowing himself to relax even marginally. The tourist spread his remaining evidence across the dining table: photographs from his primary camera, the handwritten notes from his pocket notebook, and the threatening note itself. Despite the equipment sabotage, he retained substantial documentation of both the historical context and the modern facility beneath the cabin. The question now became who to trust with this information. His first instinct, returning to local authorities, seemed increasingly problematic given the morning's research findings: the restricted zone designation, the federal intervention during the recreation area's establishment, the surveyor's experience of being denied access. All suggested potential institutional involvement rather than protection. If some government agency operated the underground facility, reporting to local officials might simply alert the very people responsible. Nevertheless, protocol and proper procedure demanded an attempt. The tourist could not pursue independent investigation of what increasingly appeared to be a significant government installation without at least attempting to follow proper channels. He would approach different officials than yesterday, perhaps finding someone willing to take his evidence seriously. The following morning, the tourist drove to the county sheriff's office, rather than returning to the park ranger station. The facility occupied a modern building near the county courthouse, its front desk staffed by a deputy who appeared to be in his early 30s. After identifying himself as a visitor reporting a potential security concern, the tourist was directed to an interview room to await an investigating officer. The sheriff's deputy who arrived introduced himself as a detective specializing in crimes against persons and property, an appropriate assignment for what the tourist had framed as potential trespassing and threatening behavior. The official appeared to be in his mid-40s with the measured demeanor of an experienced law enforcement professional. "I understand you've encountered some concerning activity while hiking in the recreation area," the detective began, notepad ready. "Can you explain exactly what happened?" The tourist provided a carefully edited account, omitting the underground facility and focusing instead on discovering an unmapped cabin, being surveilled, and receiving a threatening note. He mentioned the equipment sabotage and produced photographs of the cabin's exterior, the surveillance camera he discovered, and the note itself. The detective's expression remained professionally neutral as he examined the evidence, but subtle indicators, the tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible change in posture, suggested recognition rather than surprise. "And where exactly did you say this cabin was located?" The tourist provided coordinates from his GPS unit, watching closely as the detective recorded them. "It's in what appears to be a restricted section of the recreation area, though there's no signage indicating limited access. That section falls under special federal management," the detective replied smoothly. "It's not widely publicized to prevent unauthorized visitation, but certain areas remain closed for ongoing environmental research." He closed his notebook. "I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. We'll coordinate with federal authorities who oversee that section." "What about the threatening note?" the tourist pressed. "And the sabotage to my equipment?" "We'll include that in our report to the appropriate authorities," the detective assured him, already standing to indicate the interview's conclusion. "It sounds like you may have inadvertently interfered with sensitive research equipment. Environmental monitoring often utilizes remote cameras and specialized tools that shouldn't be disturbed." The dismissive response echoed yesterday's experience with the park ranger, but with an additional layer of apparent coordination. The detective's familiarity with the special federal management designation came too quickly, his redirection too practiced. The tourist recognized the hallmarks of institutional deflection from his years navigating corporate bureaucracies: acknowledgement without commitment, reassurance without action. "I'd like to file a formal report," the tourist insisted, "for insurance purposes regarding my damaged equipment." This request created a momentary disruption in the detective's smooth dismissal. "Of course. Wait here while I get the appropriate forms." During the detective's absence, a younger deputy entered the interview room with a cup of coffee. "Thought you might want this," he offered, placing the disposable cup on the table. "Interviews can run long." The tourist thanked him, noting the deputy's name badge identified him only as junior deputy. The younger officer lingered momentarily, then asked in a lowered voice, "You found something out in the North Ridge restricted zone?" The specific terminology, matching exactly what the surveyor had used yesterday, triggered the tourist's attention. "Yes," he confirmed cautiously. "A cabin with unusual contents." The junior deputy glanced toward the door, then spoke rapidly. "You're not the first. 3 hikers last summer, a wildlife photographer in April. They reported similar findings. All cases forwarded to federal authorities. No local follow-up permitted. What federal authorities exactly? The tourist asked, maintaining a conversational tone despite the significance of this confirmation. Nobody we recognize, the junior deputy replied. Not standard Forest Service, not regular park rangers. They show credentials, but no agency identification we can verify afterward. He straightened as footsteps approached in the hallway. Be careful. The photographer who reported this in April was involved in a single vehicle accident the following week, still in a coma at County Medical. The detective returned with standardized forms, and the junior deputy exited with a professional nod. The tourist completed the paperwork, providing accurate information about his damaged equipment while withholding the most significant aspects of his discovery. Throughout the process, the detective maintained polite disinterest, clearly going through required motions rather than initiating genuine investigation. As the tourist departed the sheriff's office, he noted a black SUV with government plates parked in a previously empty space near the entrance. The vehicle's windows were tinted beyond what seemed standard, preventing any view of its occupants. A small antenna configuration on its roof suggested communications equipment more sophisticated than typical law enforcement vehicles. The tourist drove directly to the town's small cafe rather than returning to his rental cabin, selecting a window seat that allowed him to observe the street. He ordered coffee and a late breakfast while processing this new information. The junior deputy's confirmation aligned with the pattern emerging from yesterday's research. Multiple witnesses to the cabin phenomenon, consistent institutional deflection, and now the suggestion of potential consequences for those who persisted in their investigation. Most concerning was the reference to the photographer's accident following his April report. The timing created a correlation impossible to dismiss as coincidence, especially in conjunction with the threatening note left at the cabin. Whatever the facility represented, those who operated it clearly took active measures to prevent public exposure. As the tourist considered his next steps, he noticed a familiar face entering the cafe, the records clerk from the county administrative building. The young man spotted him immediately, ordered coffee at the counter, then approached with the casual demeanor of someone encountering an acquaintance. "Mind if I join you?" the clerk asked, not waiting for an answer before sliding into the opposite chair. "Thought you should know your visit to our office yesterday generated some interest. 2 men came asking for records of everyone who accessed historical surveys in the past week." The tourist maintained a neutral expression. "Government officials? They presented federal credentials, but nothing I recognized from previous interactions with Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management personnel." The clerk kept his voice low, disguising the conversation as casual chat between acquaintances. "They were particularly interested in what materials you viewed and what copies you might have made." "What did you tell them?" "Only what's in the official log, that you viewed publicly available historical surveys. I didn't mention our conversation about my grandfather or the anomalies in the record." The clerk glanced toward the window. "They're watching your rental cabin. I noticed their vehicle on my way to work this morning." This escalation demanded immediate response. The tourist had planned to spend another day gathering information before departing, but surveillance of his accommodation significantly altered the risk assessment. "I appreciate the warning," he said simply. The clerk nodded. "Whatever you found out there, it's been happening for decades. My grandfather mentioned strange lights in that valley back in the 1960s. The retired forest ranger I mentioned, Harrison on County Road 23, he tried to document it officially in 1978, took early retirement the following month. This historical context reinforced the pattern of institutional suppression while providing another potential information source. "Thank you," the tourist said sincerely, "for taking a professional risk to share this." "Just maintaining proper records," the clerk replied with a thin smile, standing to leave. "That's my job, making sure information doesn't just disappear." He departed without further conversation, leaving his coffee mostly untouched. The tourist remained at the cafe for another 30 minutes, organizing his thoughts and planning his next actions. Surveillance of his rental cabin complicated immediate departure. His luggage remained inside, along with his laptop containing research files not backed up to cloud storage due to the lack of reliable internet. Yet returning now risked confrontation with whoever watched the property. As he paid his bill, the tourist noticed a small business card that had not been there previously, partially concealed beneath his napkin. It contained a single printed line: "Memorial Observer, Room 212, 3 p.m. today." No name, no contact information, just the designation of a local newspaper and what appeared to be an appointment. This unexpected development provided both opportunity and risk. If legitimate, it offered potential media exposure, precisely what the institutional suppression seemed designed to prevent. If a trap, it represented another escalation in the apparent effort to contain his investigation. The tourist pocketed the card, decision already forming. The historical documentation of ongoing operations since the 1890s, these represented a discovery beyond mere government secrecy. Something truly unprecedented occurred in that seemingly abandoned cabin, something worth decades of concealment and active suppression. The tourist checked his remaining functional camera, confirming its memory card remained secure and its battery charged. Whatever happened next, the evidence would not disappear as easily as previous investigations apparently had. He had spent 20 years analyzing patterns and identifying anomalies in data. Professional skills now focused on a mystery far beyond market trends and consumer behavior. Something impossible existed in those mountains, and he intended to document it fully, regardless of the escalating threats now surrounding his investigation. The tourist sat in his parked vehicle 3 blocks from his rental cabin, methodically organizing his next moves. The digital clock on the dashboard read 1:17 p.m., less than 2 hours before the mysterious appointment at the local newspaper office. His rental cabin remained under surveillance according to the clerk's warning, placing his remaining possessions and research materials at risk. The equipment sabotage at the cabin clearing and the junior deputy's ominous reference to the hospitalized photographer indicated escalating stakes. This was no longer mere investigation, but potentially life-threatening. 20 years of corporate crisis management had trained the tourist to function under pressure. He extracted his phone and composed a carefully worded email to his operations director back home, a woman who had worked alongside him for 15 years and possessed both the competence and discretion to handle sensitive situations. The message contained no explicit details of his discovery, but established clear contingency protocols. Investigating unusual property situation in mountain recreation area. If no contact from me by 9 a.m. tomorrow, please execute Emergency Protocol B from the company handbook. Contact list and access codes in the secure server folder. Reference keyword, Blackwater. The tourist attached 3 encrypted image files, just enough documentation to establish credibility without revealing the full scope of his discovery. The encryption required his personal password plus a secondary authentication only his operations director possessed, ensuring the evidence remained secure until deliberately accessed. He sent the message, watching until the confirmation appeared despite the weak signal. Next, he created a more comprehensive evidence package. Using his remaining functional camera, portable drive, and phone, he consolidated his documentation, photographs of the cabin's interior and exterior, images of the historical records, coordinates of the location, and detailed notes of his investigation. He compressed and encrypted these files, then uploaded them to 3 separate secure cloud storage locations using different accounts and access credentials. The tourist drafted a detailed document explaining the chronology of his discovery and subsequent investigation, naming every official he'd encountered and every location he'd visited. He included the coordinates of the cabin, references to the Western Geographical Society, and descriptions of both the chronological photograph display and the underground facility. This document, along with selected photographs, he saved to a small USB drive, which he concealed in a hidden pocket sewn into his belt, a security measure from previous travels in politically unstable regions. For redundancy, the tourist prepared a physical package as well, printed photographs, handwritten notes, and the original threatening note secured in a waterproof pouch. This package he addressed simply to Legal Department, with his company's address, ready for express delivery should the opportunity arise. The memorial card from the cafe, Memorial Observer, Room 212, 3 p.m. today, remained in his shirt pocket, a potential lifeline or possible trap. With preparations complete, the tourist faced the immediate challenge, retrieving essential items from his rental cabin while under surveillance. A direct approach risked confrontation with whoever monitored the property. Instead, he drove to a hiking equipment store he'd noticed earlier in the town, purchasing a mid-range pair of binoculars and a local trail map. These provided both cover for his next actions and potentially useful tools. From a public overlook a quarter-mile from his rental cabin, the tourist used his new binoculars to observe the property. A dark sedan with tinted windows was parked approximately 50 yards down the access road, positioned to observe the cabin's entrance while maintaining distance. The vehicle's government-style plates matched the description of what the clerk had reported. Through the binoculars, the tourist could make out the silhouette of at least one occupant in the driver's seat, though the tinted windows obscured detailed identification. The rental cabin's location on a wooded slope provided an advantage. While the front entrance remained under clear surveillance, the rear of the property backed against denser forest with a maintenance path used by the rental company's staff. Having explored these woods briefly during his first evening at the property, the tourist knew this path connected to a service road approximately quarter-mile northwest. The tourist drove to a public trailhead near this service road, parking among other hikers' vehicles to avoid drawing attention. He adjusted his appearance slightly, removing his distinctive jacket and donning a generic baseball cap purchased from the equipment store. The transformation wasn't elaborate, but sufficient to prevent easy identification at a distance. The approach to his rental cabin through the woods required 30 minutes of careful navigation, using natural features for concealment. The tourist moved with practiced quiet, placing each foot deliberately to minimize sound. When he finally reached the rear of the property, he paused behind a cluster of pines, observing for any signs of additional surveillance before proceeding. The cabin's rear entrance, a sliding glass door leading to a small deck, remained unmonitored from his vantage point. The tourist waited through 2 full minutes of absolute stillness, controlling his breathing while scanning for any movement or reflection that might indicate observation devices. Detecting nothing, he advanced quickly across the exposed deck and entered using his key. Inside, the tourist moved with silent efficiency, gathering only essential items: his laptop, passport, wallet, phone charger, and a change of clothes packed into a small day pack rather than his more conspicuous luggage. He transferred research files from his laptop to another encrypted drive, then performed a secure wipe of the computer's browser history and temporary files. Whatever happened next, he would leave no easily accessible digital trail. As he prepared to exit, the tourist noticed something that stopped him cold: a business card on the kitchen counter that definitely hadn't been there when he left earlier. The card, identical to the one slipped to him at the cafe, displayed the same text: Memorial Observer, Room 212, 3 p.m. today. The positioning was deliberate, centrally placed where it couldn't be missed, a clear message that someone had entered his rental while he was away. More concerning was what this implied. Whoever monitored his movements knew about the newspaper meeting, yet had chosen to reinforce rather than prevent it. The tourist photographed the card in place, then departed through the rear door, retracing his path through the woods with heightened vigilance. The sense of being caught between opposing forces intensified. Someone wanted him at this meeting enough to risk exposing their surveillance. By 2:30 p.m., the tourist had returned to his vehicle and driven to a position 2 blocks from the newspaper office. The Memorial Observer occupied the second floor of a brick building on the town's main street, above a real estate office. From his vantage point, the tourist observed the building's entrance and surrounding area, looking for surveillance or anything unusual. The street maintained normal small-town afternoon activity: pedestrians moving between shops, local vehicles parking and departing. Nothing that triggered his now heightened threat assessment. The tourist checked his secured evidence once more, confirming both digital and physical packages remained intact. Whatever waited in room 212, he had ensured the documentation would survive even if he did not. The junior deputy's reference to the photographer's accident remained prominent in his thoughts, a warning that those protecting the cabin's secrets employed methods beyond mere intimidation. At 2:55 p.m., the tourist approached the newspaper office, maintaining situational awareness without appearing overtly cautious. He climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, finding a modest office suite with frosted glass doors bearing the newspaper's logo, a stylized mountain peak with an open eye above it. The reception area stood empty, but a directory board listed Conference Room 212 at the end of a short hallway. The tourist checked his watch, 2:58 p.m., and proceeded toward the designated room, each step measured and deliberate. The building's aged floorboards creaked slightly beneath his weight, the sound unnervingly similar to the cabin's porch steps. He paused outside room 212, listening for voices or movement inside. Hearing nothing, he knocked firmly, then stepped slightly to the side of the door, a security habit from corporate negotiations in volatile regions. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s with silver hair and the weathered complexion of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. He wore no press credentials, no identification of any kind, but his posture and evaluative gaze suggested military or law enforcement background rather than journalism. The man gestured for the tourist to enter without speaking, closing the door immediately after. The conference room contained a simple arrangement: a rectangular table with 6 chairs, a wall-mounted whiteboard, and windows overlooking the town's main street. A woman approximately the same age as the silver-haired man sat at the far end of the table, a leather portfolio open before her. Like her companion, she displayed no identification or newspaper credentials. "We have 30 minutes, the woman stated without introduction. "Show us what you found in Blackwater Valley." The tourist remained standing just inside the conference room door, maintaining distance from both individuals while assessing the situation. Their knowledge of Blackwater Valley, the local name absent from official maps, suggested either legitimate investigative interest or concerning insider awareness. Their lack of introduction or credentials amplified his caution. "Before I share anything," the tourist responded evenly, "I need to know who you represent and why you're interested in what I've found." The silver-haired man exchanged a glance with his female companion, a silent communication suggesting long partnership. "We were stationed at the North Ridge facility from 1981 to 1989, he explained, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of military precision. "We've been monitoring it independently since our separation from the program." "Former Department of Energy," the woman added, opening her portfolio to reveal aged identification cards with federal seals. "Special Projects Division. What you stumbled upon was originally called Project Chronograph, at least during our involvement. It's had many designations since 1897. The tourist studied their credentials without approaching closer. The IDs appeared authentic, though decades old, displaying government formatting consistent with the early 1980s. More convincing was their specific knowledge. The reference to 1897 aligned precisely with the historical records he'd discovered at the county library. The facility beneath the cabin, the tourist ventured, testing their knowledge. What was its actual purpose? "Temporal displacement monitoring," the silver-haired man replied without hesitation. "The site sits at a naturally occurring chronological fracture point, a location where the normal linear progression of time experiences inconsistencies. The Western Geographical Society discovered it accidentally while surveying the valley. The government has maintained continuous monitoring ever since. We left when the program shifted from passive monitoring to active experimentation," the woman added, her expression tightening. "When we objected to the potential risks, we were removed from the project and placed under lifetime confidentiality restrictions, which we are violating by speaking to you now." The tourist made a decision, extracting his phone and displaying a photograph of the cabin's interior with its walls covered in chronologically arranged images. "Then perhaps you can explain this. Thousands of photographs showing the same cabin across different time periods. And this," he swiped to the image of the large central photograph showing himself taking that very picture. The former agents leaned forward simultaneously, expressions shifting from controlled neutrality to visible concern. "They've progressed to full temporal imaging," the silver-haired man murmured, almost to himself. "When did you first visit the cabin?" "The exact date and time, if you remember." 2 days ago, approximately 1:30 p.m., the tourist answered. The woman calculated quickly. "And you returned yesterday?" "Yes, late afternoon." "The chronological consistency is collapsing," she said to her partner. "If he's appearing in images before his actual visit, the containment protocols have failed completely." Their evident alarm convinced the tourist of their authenticity more than any credentials could have. He described the underground facility in detail, the modern equipment, the central platform with its camera array, the scheduled timestamps he'd observed on the monitoring system. With each detail, the former agents exchanged increasingly troubled glances. "You need to leave town immediately," the silver-haired man stated flatly. "The project has contingency protocols for containment breaches. Once they confirm you've documented the facility, those protocols will activate." "What does that mean exactly?" the tourist asked, though he already suspected the answer based on the junior deputy's reference to the photographer's accident. "It means you're already targeted," the woman replied. "Everyone you've spoken with is compromised. The librarian, the county clerk, anyone who's assisted your investigation. They'll isolate and eliminate the exposure. It's happened before." The tourist described the surveillance at his rental cabin, the equipment sabotage, and the identical business cards left at both the cafe and his cabin. The former agents listened intently, their expressions darkening. "The cards weren't from us," the silver-haired man confirmed. We've maintained absolute operational security since contacting you. Someone else is monitoring your movements, likely project security attempting to assess how much you've documented and who you've shared it with. We need to move this conversation elsewhere, the woman interjected, gathering her portfolio. This location is compromised if they're tracking you this closely. The tourist shared his contingency preparations, the encrypted files uploaded to secure cloud storage, the message to his operations director, the physical evidence package. The former agents nodded approval at his thoroughness. Smart precautions, the silver-haired man acknowledged, but insufficient against what you're facing. The project has resources beyond conventional federal operations, dedicated personnel, specialized equipment, and authority structures outside normal oversight. Your evidence needs wider distribution immediately. The woman checked her watch. We have a secure location 20 minutes from here. We can help distribute your documentation through channels they can't easily suppress or trace. The tourist weighed his options. These former agents offered potential assistance in exposing the truth, yet following them meant leaving public spaces for an unknown location. The detailed knowledge they'd displayed about the facility suggested legitimacy, but his corporate experience had taught him that the most convincing deceptions always contained substantial truth. I'll follow in my vehicle, the tourist decided, a compromise that maintained his independent mobility. The former agents exchanged another glance. Acceptable, the silver-haired man nodded. We'll take Mountain Route 16, then Forest Service Road 42. If you note any surveillance or feel the situation change, break contact immediately and proceed to the state police headquarters in the next county. They're outside local jurisdiction. As they prepared to depart, the woman handed the tourist a small device resembling a key fob. Signal disruptor, she explained. It won't block sophisticated tracking, but it'll interfere with commercial GPS locators. Keep it with you. The group exited the newspaper office separately, the former agents departing first while the tourist waited 5 minutes before following. He maintained vigilance during the brief walk to his vehicle, noting nothing obviously suspicious among the pedestrians or parked cars along the main street. Once inside his Jeep, he activated the signal disruptor and began following the route described. Mountain Route 16 wound through increasingly remote terrain, climbing steadily into densely forested hills northeast of town. The tourist maintained visual contact with the former agent's vehicle, an older model SUV with Colorado plates, while constantly checking his mirrors for signs of pursuit. The afternoon sun cast lengthening shadows across the mountain road, creating alternating patterns of brightness and gloom as he navigated between exposed ridgelines and sheltered valleys. After approximately 15 minutes, the former agent's SUV signaled a right turn onto a narrow, unpaved road, marked only with a faded Forest Service designation. The tourist followed, immediately noting the deteriorating road conditions. This was a seldom-used access route rather than a main service road. His Jeep handled the rough terrain adequately, though he reduced speed to navigate around larger potholes and exposed rocks. The forest grew increasingly dense on either side, pine and spruce creating a natural tunnel that limited visibility beyond the immediate roadway. The tourist checked his phone, confirming he'd lost signal several miles back, exactly as expected in these remote mountains. The signal disruptor remained active in his center console, its small indicator light pulsing steadily. After another 10 minutes of increasingly rough driving, the tourist's instincts triggered an alarm. The coordinates on his GPS unit, which he'd been monitoring despite the presumed signal disruption, showed them trending northwest, directly toward Blackwater Valley and the cabin site. The former agents had described their destination as a secure location, but the directional heading suggested they were returning to precisely where the danger originated. The tourist reduced speed further, creating additional distance between his vehicle and theirs while he reassessed. The isolated forest road offered limited options, continuing forward, attempting to turn around on the narrow track, or possibly finding a side path. Before he could implement any of these options, the former agent's SUV stopped abruptly around the next curve, positioning sideways across the road to block passage. The tourist braked hard, maintaining 50 yards of separation. Through his windshield, he observed the silver-haired man exit the SUV and gesture urgently for him to approach. Something in the man's posture, a new stiffness, a subtle shift in how he held his shoulders, triggered the tourist's professional instincts for detecting deception. 20 years of reading corporate negotiators across conference tables had honed this awareness to near subconscious levels. Instead of advancing, the tourist shifted into reverse, simultaneously reaching to disable the signal disruptor. As he did, he noticed something he'd overlooked initially. The device had no manufacturer markings, no battery compartment, no typical indicators of consumer electronics. It wasn't disrupting tracking signals, it was generating them. The tourist executed a rapid reverse turn, the Jeep's tires skidding slightly on the loose surface as he maneuvered in the confined space. Through his rearview mirror, he saw the silver-haired man sprint back to the SUV, his previously measured movements replaced by urgent efficiency. The tourist completed his turn and accelerated away, searching for any side path that might provide an alternate route. Approximately 200 yards back, he spotted a narrow trail breaking from the main road, little more than twin tracks through underbrush, but sufficient for his vehicle's clearance. He swerved onto this path without reducing speed, pushing the Jeep's suspension to its limits as he navigated between close-set trees. Behind him, engine sounds confirmed pursuit, the former agent's SUV negotiating the same turn. The forest trail ascended sharply, following a natural ridgeline rather than an engineered grade. The tourist's awareness narrowed to immediate challenges: a protruding boulder requiring last-second avoidance, low branches scraping against the windshield, sections where erosion had created treacherous cross-gullies. He maintained maximum safe speed, using the terrain to increase separation from his pursuers. The trail crested suddenly, breaking into an unexpected clearing that the tourist recognized immediately from his topographical map, the ridge overlooking Blackwater Valley. Below, perfectly centered in the natural amphitheater of surrounding peaks, stood the cabin. From this elevated vantage point, he could see what had been obscured during his ground-level investigations: a perimeter of modern equipment installed in a precise circle around the cabin, disguised by camouflage netting but visible from above. The tourist didn't slow to study this revelation. He continued across the clearing, following the trail as it descended the opposite side of the ridge. The gradient increased dramatically, forcing him to modulate his braking to prevent dangerous skids on the loose surface. His pursuit training from a corporate security course a decade earlier provided critical techniques: control through engine braking, maintaining traction by avoiding complete wheel lock, using the entire width of the available path to reduce effective grade. Behind him, the former agent's SUV appeared at the ridgeline, silhouetted momentarily against the sky before beginning its own descent. The heavier vehicle struggled with the steep gradient, falling further behind as the tourist navigated the difficult terrain with greater agility. When the trail split unexpectedly, he chose the less obvious path without hesitation, banking on local knowledge the pursuers might lack. This gamble paid off when the narrow track suddenly intersected a maintained Forest Service road, different from their approach route and clearly marked with standard designations. The tourist accelerated onto the improved surface, quickly gaining speed while checking coordinates against his mental map of the area. This road would eventually connect with the main highway approximately 7 miles southeast, if he could maintain his lead for that distance. The forest opened occasionally into small clearings, providing brief moments of improved visibility. During one such opening, the tourist checked his mirrors and confirmed his pursuers had chosen the wrong path at the split. No vehicle visible behind him, despite clear sight lines for several hundred yards. He maintained speed regardless, unwilling to assume safety until reaching public highways. After 15 minutes of sustained driving, the Forest Service road joined the paved highway connecting the recreation area to the nearest major town. The tourist merged into normal traffic, immediately adopting civilian driving patterns, precisely at the speed limit, proper signaling, nothing that would draw attention from law enforcement or distinguish his vehicle from typical tourist traffic. Only when he'd traveled 20 minutes on the main highway, putting substantial distance between himself and Blackwater Valley, did the tourist allow himself to process what had occurred. The former agents had never intended to help distribute his evidence. Their objective had been returning him to the cabin site. Their knowledge of the facility had been genuine, but their claimed separation from the project had been the deception, revealed ultimately by their chosen route. The tourist checked his evidence packages, confirming both digital and physical documentation remained secure. His phone displayed normal operation after removing the tracking device, which he'd discarded along the forest route. The immediate danger appeared neutralized, but the larger threat remained: a government operation with sufficient resources to employ convincing former agents as assets, monitoring an apparent temporal anomaly with technology beyond conventional understanding. His contingency plans now became primary, the distribution of evidence to multiple outlets simultaneously, creating a disclosure too widespread for containment. The tourist set course for the nearest city with substantial media presence, approximately 90 minutes further along the highway. There he would implement the final phase of his investigation, transforming private discovery into public exposure. The regional city offered welcome anonymity after the increasingly threatening confines of the small mountain town. The tourist navigated to the downtown district, parking in a public garage with multiple exits and heavy foot traffic, environmental security through population density and surveillance cameras. His first action utilized this urban infrastructure, visiting a shipping service store to send his physical evidence package to his company's legal department via next-day delivery, payment in cash to minimize transaction records. His next destination was the regional office of a national news network, occupying 3 floors of a downtown office building. Without appointment, the tourist requested to speak with an investigative journalist regarding a government installation operating outside oversight. The reception staff responded with professional skepticism, offering a generic contact email rather than direct access to reporting staff. The tourist anticipated this initial barrier. He extracted his phone and displayed a single photograph, the underground facility with its central platform and monitoring equipment. "This is operating on public land without congressional approval or budget allocation," he stated simply. "I have complete documentation, including historical records dating to 1897 and evidence of ongoing temporal experimentation outside any known physics program." The specificity of this statement, combined with the professional quality of the photograph, triggered the receptionist's journalistic instincts despite corporate protocols. A series of phone calls followed, resulting in the tourist being escorted to a small conference room to await an investigative producer. The woman who arrived 15 minutes later introduced herself simply as Senior Producer, Investigative Division, maintaining the pattern of functional titles rather than personal identification that had characterized this entire experience. "You have 10 minutes to convince me this isn't elaborate fiction," the producer stated directly, activating a recording device on the conference table. The tourist provided a concise summary of his discovery, supporting each claim with specific photographic evidence: the cabin's exterior and interior photograph display, the underground facility with its modern equipment, historical documents establishing the Western Geographical Society's original presence, and the threatening note referencing temporal interference protocols. He explained his research process, the pattern of institutional deflection from local authorities, and the attempted deception by the former agents. Most compelling was the sequence of photographs showing himself inside the cabin, taking the very images being displayed. The producer studied these with increasing focus, her professional skepticism visibly yielding to journalistic interest. "If this is authentic," she stated carefully, "it represents a significant story requiring substantial verification and legal review before broadcast. Government black projects operate in legal gray areas, and claims involving temporal anomalies invite scientific scrutiny beyond typical fact-checking." "I understand the verification requirements," the tourist responded. "I've prepared comprehensive documentation, including coordinates, witness identifications, and chronological records of all interactions. What I need immediately is secure distribution, multiple copies in different hands to prevent suppression." This approach, acknowledging journalistic standards while emphasizing the security implications, resonated with the producer's professional experience. "We can begin preliminary investigation while protecting your documentation," she confirmed. "Our legal department maintains secure protocols for whistleblower materials." Over the next 2 hours, the tourist transferred his complete evidence package to the network's secured systems, while providing recorded testimony detailing his investigation from initial discovery through the pursuit earlier that day. Throughout this process, additional journalistic and legal staff joined the session, asking increasingly specific questions that tested the consistency and credibility of his account. As this documentation process concluded, the producer outlined next steps. "We'll dispatch an investigative team to independently verify key elements while our Washington Bureau pursues Freedom of Information requests regarding any classified programs operating in that region. If your documentation passes verification, we'll coordinate with our legal department on the timeline for public disclosure." "How long will verification require?" the tourist asked, conscious that time worked against exposure. "For preliminary confirmation, 48 to 72 hours. The producer estimated. For broadcast-ready verification meeting our standards, approximately 1 week. We'll maintain secure communication channels with you throughout this process. This timeline exceeded the tourist safety threshold based on previous containment patterns. The program has demonstrated aggressive suppression protocols, he emphasized. Documentation needs immediate wider distribution beyond a single organization. The producer considered this request against journalistic competitive instincts, then nodded agreement. We can coordinate with trusted counterparts at competing networks and publications, a simultaneous investigation protocol we've employed for certain national security stories. This distributes both the verification burden and creates mutual insurance against suppression. That's exactly what I need, the tourist confirmed. By early evening, the tourist's evidence had been securely copied to the network systems and arrangements made for distribution to 3 additional major news organizations under coordinated investigation agreements. Each would independently verify key elements while sharing critical findings, creating interlocking coverage that no single intervention could entirely suppress. For additional security, the tourist uploaded selected documentation to a secured cloud folder accessible to his operations director, with instructions for automatic release to international media outlets if verification from U.S. organizations stalled or showed signs of interference. This global failsafe provided final insurance against domestic suppression attempts. As these preparations concluded, the producer escorted the tourist to a secure conference room where representatives from the participating news organizations had gathered via video conference. "We need to discuss your personal security during the verification phase," she explained. "Based on your account, individuals associated with this program have demonstrated concerning surveillance and intervention capabilities. The collective journalistic experience in the room produced practical security protocols, temporary relocation to a corporate apartment maintained for confidential sources, communications through secured channels only, and preliminary legal protection through formal whistleblower documentation with the network's attorneys. These measures balance the tourist's safety against his continued availability for the verification process." "What happens now?" the tourist asked as these arrangements concluded. "Now we investigate," the producer replied simply. "Every claim, every location, every document. If verified, this story will generate significant public interest and likely congressional investigation. The combination of unauthorized government operations, unexplained phenomena, and decades-long concealment creates compelling coverage across political spectrums." 3 days later, the verification process had progressed sufficiently for initial reporting. The tourist watched from the secured apartment as the first news segment aired, carefully framed as "allegations under investigation," rather than confirmed facts, but presenting key elements of his documentation with journalistic credibility. The segment included satellite imagery of the cabin location, historical photographs of the Western Geographical Society installation, and interviews with academic experts on classified government research programs. Additional outlets followed with their own reporting angles, one focusing on the historical timeline and apparent budget concealment, another examining the scientific implications of the claimed temporal anomaly research. By the 4th day, the story had achieved sufficient momentum to trigger official responses. First, categorical denials from local Forest Service representatives, then carefully worded, neither confirm nor deny statements from Department of Energy spokespeople regarding historical research programs. On the 5th day, satellite news vans appeared in the small mountain town, their crews interviewing local residents about the mysterious cabin and restricted area that had apparently existed in their community for generations. The county records clerk spoke on camera about historical documentation inconsistencies, while the junior deputy described previous reports from hikers that had been systematically dismissed by authorities. By the 6th day, congressional representatives from the state announced a formal inquiry into unauthorized research programs operating on public lands without oversight. Satellite imagery broadcast nationally showed unusual activity around Blackwater Valley, vehicles and personnel establishing a perimeter that further confirmed the site's significance beyond official denials. On the 7th day, the tourist stood at the window of his temporary accommodation, watching live helicopter footage on the room's television as a convoy of unmarked government vehicles approached the cabin site. The camera zoomed in on personnel establishing equipment around the perimeter, their movements displaying military precision despite civilian clothing. The news anchor described the scene as an apparent secure operation by unidentified federal personnel at the site of alleged classified research activities. The tourist felt a complex mixture of emotions as he watched the operation unfold. Relief that the truth had finally emerged beyond possibility of containment. Concern for those who had assisted his investigation and might face repercussions. Professional satisfaction at having methodically documented and exposed something deliberately concealed. And lingering unease about the fundamental nature of what he'd discovered, a place where time itself appeared to operate differently than understood by conventional science. As the helicopter camera panned across Blackwater Valley, briefly capturing the cabin before authorities established a no-fly zone, the tourist recalled the impossible photograph that had first frozen him in shock, his own image captured before he'd ever entered the building. Whatever temporal anomaly existed in that location, whatever government program had monitored or manipulated it for over a century, was now subjected to the disinfectant of public scrutiny. The tourist turned from the window and began packing his few belongings. The network's security protocols would continue until the story fully stabilized, but his active role had concluded. He had done what his 20 years of professional experience had trained him to do: identify a pattern others had missed, document it methodically, and bring it to appropriate attention. The rest now belonged to journalists, investigators, and eventually historians. As media coverage continued on the television behind him, the tourist allowed himself a moment of reflection. His annual wilderness retreat had become something he could never have anticipated, a confrontation with phenomena beyond conventional understanding and institutional forces determined to maintain secrecy. Yet the evidence now existed in too many locations for containment, the narrative too widely distributed for suppression. Whatever waited in Blackwater Valley, whatever had been happening in that cabin since 1897, would finally be examined in the light of public awareness rather than the shadows of classified operation. The tourist had done what needed to be done, transforming personal discovery into collective knowledge, regardless of whatever temporal impossibilities existed in that seemingly abandoned cabin in the Colorado mountains. 2 weeks after the initial media exposure, the tourist sat in a secure conference room at the regional FBI field office, surrounded by federal agents, Justice Department officials, and specialized investigators from multiple agencies. The walls displayed enlarged photographs of the cabin and underground facility, alongside complex timeline charts documenting the century-long operation. What had begun as one person's accidental discovery had escalated into one of the largest covert program investigations in recent history. "We appreciate your continued cooperation," stated the lead federal investigator, a woman in her 50s whose credentials identified her only as Special Oversight Division. She spread a series of satellite images across the table. "Based on your documentation and subsequent investigation, we've confirmed the full scope of the Blackwater Valley installation extends well beyond the visible cabin structure. The images revealed what ground-level observation had concealed: a sophisticated facility extending underground throughout much of the valley, with concealed access points disguised as natural features. Thermal imaging showed heat signatures from equipment operating beneath seemingly undisturbed forest floor. Ground-penetrating radar had mapped an extensive network of tunnels and chambers far larger than the single underground room the tourist had discovered. The operation appears to have expanded continuously since its inception in 1897, explained a Department of Energy scientist assigned to the investigation team. What began as observation of naturally occurring temporal anomalies evolved into active experimentation by the 1940s, then into something far more ambitious by the early 1970s. The chronological photography display you documented represents only the surface-level manifestation of much more extensive temporal research. Most disturbing were the preliminary findings regarding operational oversight, or rather, its absence. Congressional subcommittee inquiries had revealed no authorization for the facility's continued operation after 1962, no budget allocations through normal channels, and no oversight from established scientific review boards. The installation had effectively gone off books, operating within a bureaucratic blind spot for over 6 decades. "We've identified 17 individuals who've been operating the facility in recent years," the federal investigator continued, sliding forward a document with redacted photographs. "Most held official positions within various agencies while maintaining unofficial assignments to what they called Project Kronos. Their operational security protocols included active suppression of accidental discoveries, precisely what you encountered." This revelation led to the most troubling aspect of the investigation: the confirmation of previous suppression activities. The federal team had documented 23 cases over the past 40 years where hikers, forestry workers, or environmental researchers had stumbled upon aspects of the Blackwater Valley operation, only to face orchestrated discreditation, career destruction, or in 7 cases, apparent accidents, resulting in deaths classified as misadventures. The photographer who reported the cabin in April remains in a medically induced coma, confirmed a Justice Department representative. Forensic analysis of his vehicle indicates deliberate tampering with the brake system. We've placed his medical care under federal protection while the investigation continues. The tourist absorbed this information with a complex mixture of vindication and horror. His corporate experience had prepared him to recognize institutional concealment, but the human cost of this particular cover-up exceeded anything he had anticipated when first stepping into that seemingly abandoned cabin. What about the temporal anomalies themselves? The tourist asked. The photographs showing impossible chronology, the equipment measuring what they called temporal displacement. Was that scientific reality or elaborate deception? The room fell silent, federal officials exchanging glances that communicated institutional caution. Finally, the Energy Department scientist responded with careful precision. We've confirmed the presence of measurable space-time irregularities in Blackwater Valley, he stated. Certain locations within the installation demonstrate verifiable inconsistencies in chronological progression, what laypersons might call time running differently. The physics involved remains beyond current theoretical understanding, but the effects themselves appear genuine. This confirmation, delivered with such bureaucratic understatement, represented perhaps the most significant scientific revelation of the century. The tourist noted the tension between the magnitude of this discovery and the institutional reluctance to acknowledge its full implications. The photographic documentation you discovered, the scientist continued, appears to be both experimental evidence and practical application of these anomalies. By positioning recording devices at specific coordinates within the irregularity field, they could capture images across what we would perceive as different time periods. The underground facility contained equipment designed to predict, measure, and potentially manipulate these temporal variances. As the briefing continued, the scale of official response became apparent. 5 federal agencies had established a joint task force specifically for the Blackwater Valley investigation. 3 congressional committees had initiated oversight inquiries into unauthorized research operations. The Justice Department had impaneled a special grand jury to consider criminal charges against identified program personnel, focusing particularly on the suppression activities that had resulted in civilian harm. 11 arrests have been executed thus far, the federal investigator reported, including both active program personnel and former agents involved in suppression activities. The silver-haired man and woman who attempted to return you to the facility have been identified as former military intelligence officers contracted specifically for containment operations. They remain at large but under active pursuit. The coordination extended internationally as well, with scientific delegations from major research institutions requesting access to study the temporal anomalies under proper oversight. What had operated for decades in secrecy had become the focus of legitimate scientific inquiry, with protocols for public safety and transparent documentation replacing the previous regime of concealment and suppression. Most immediately relevant to the surrounding community, the investigation had uncovered the mechanism of local complicity. Key officials throughout the county, including the senior park ranger, sheriff's detective, and various administrative personnel, had been systematically compromised through a combination of classified authority invocation and, in some cases, direct financial inducement. These officials now face their own legal consequences, with interim appointments ensuring continued government functions during the investigation. The regional recovery operation will take months, concluded the federal investigator, properly documenting the facility, securing potentially hazardous experimental equipment, and establishing scientific protocols for studying the anomalies without risk to researchers or the public. But the immediate threat, the operational suppression capability, has been neutralized. For the tourist, this official confirmation represented the culmination of his investigation. What began as personal curiosity transformed into systematic exposure of wrongdoing at institutional scale. Yet the human impact extended far beyond official reports and legal proceedings. The small mountain community had awakened to decades of deception operating literally beneath their feet, while families of previous victims finally received acknowledgement of what had happened to their loved ones. What happens to the cabin itself? The tourist asked as the briefing concluded. The original structure where the photographs were displayed? It's been secured as evidence, the federal investigator replied. Once forensic documentation completes, it will likely be preserved as both historical site and scientific research location. The temporal phenomena remain centered there, according to preliminary measurements. As the tourist departed the federal building, he passed through a perimeter of media representatives who had maintained constant presence since the story broke. National news anchors delivered live reports with the government complex as backdrop, while scientific correspondents attempted to explain temporal anomaly concepts to general audiences. The story had transcended mere government secrecy scandal, touching something deeper in the public consciousness. The possibility that fundamental assumptions about reality itself might require reconsideration. What had begun with one person freezing in horror at an impossible photograph had catalyzed a transformation in both scientific understanding and institutional accountability. The tourist moved through the media gauntlet without engaging, his role as whistleblower now secondary to the larger implications of what he had discovered. The truth had emerged into public consciousness, the machinery of official investigation now advancing what his individual efforts had initiated. 3 months after the initial exposure, the tourist stood uncomfortably on a small stage erected on the grounds of the state capitol building. Behind him, a row of government officials, the governor, 2 senators, multiple representatives, and the state attorney general, sat in formal arrangement. Before him stretched several hundred people, a mixture of media representatives, victims' families, and members of the public drawn by the ceremony's significance. For exceptional courage in bringing to light unauthorized government operations and ensuring accountability for actions that harmed both individuals and public trust, the governor stated, reading from an official proclamation. We present this commendation for distinguished civilian service to the public interest. The tourist accepted the framed certificate with appropriate gratitude, though the formality of the ceremony struck him as somehow inadequate compared to the human cost of the Blackwater Valley operation. His gaze moved past the officials to the families seated in a reserved section, relatives of those who had encountered the facility over decades and suffered consequences ranging from career destruction to fatal accidents. Their presence provided the genuine context for the day's recognition. When invited to speak, the tourist approached the microphone with characteristic understatement. This recognition belongs primarily to those who paid far greater prices for encountering the truth, he began, gesturing toward the families. Individuals who discovered aspects of this operation years or decades before I did, and who faced systematic suppression without the protection of public exposure that ultimately shielded me. He acknowledged several specifically. The wildlife photographer who remained hospitalized, though now conscious and recovering. The Forest Service employee from the 1970s who lost his career after reporting unusual activities in the restricted zone. The environmental researcher whose findings were discredited through orchestrated academic sabotage. In each case, the tourist emphasized their courage rather than his own role in the eventual exposure. What happened in Blackwater Valley represents a failure of institutional accountability, the tourist continued, departing from expected ceremonial remarks. A scientific discovery of potentially transformative significance was kept from legitimate research through decades of increasingly unauthorized operation. More disturbingly, the protection of this secrecy came to supersede both legal authority and basic human decency. The officials behind him shifted uncomfortably at this direct assessment, though none could dispute its accuracy given the ongoing federal investigation. 11 former program officials now faced criminal charges, while congressional oversight hearings had exposed systemic failures in monitoring classified research operations. The ceremonial recognition occurring today existed alongside substantive reform efforts addressing the structural problems that had allowed the Blackwater operation to continue unchecked for generations. The temporal anomalies discovered in 1897 represented a legitimate scientific phenomenon worthy of careful study, the tourist acknowledged. What was not legitimate was the eventual prioritization of secrecy over safety, control over scientific advancement, and institutional self-protection over human lives. When research concealment becomes more important than ethical conduct, we've abandoned the very purpose of scientific inquiry. As the ceremony concluded, the tourist spoke privately with several families of previous Blackwater Valley victims. Their responses varied from tearful gratitude for the validation of long-dismissed claims to quiet determination as they pursued long-delayed justice through newly available legal channels. For many, the public recognition represented not conclusion, but continuation, the beginning of a process through which truth might eventually reconcile with decades of institutional deception. The formal reception following the ceremony brought the tourist into conversation with scientific representatives now properly studying the temporal anomalies under transparent protocols. A physicist from a prominent research institution described the preliminary findings with controlled excitement. The space-time irregularities in Blackwater Valley appear to be natural phenomena related to unique geological and electromagnetic properties at that specific location, she explained. What makes this discovery so significant is that it demonstrates localized variations in temporal progression that existing physics models cannot fully explain. With proper study, this could eventually transform our understanding of time itself. And the photographs? The tourist asked, recalling the chronological display that had first frozen him in horror. The images showing the cabin across different time periods, including my own visit before it occurred, those represent the most tangible manifestation of the anomaly, the physicist confirmed. By positioning recording devices at precise coordinates within the field effect, the operators could capture visual information across what we experience as different time periods. The most recent experimental protocols apparently attempted to achieve more direct interaction between temporal frames, though the ethics and safety of such experimentation remain highly problematic. This scientific context provided framework for the tourist's personal experience without diminishing its fundamental strangeness. The cabin had indeed contained something beyond normal understanding, a window into temporal mechanics that challenged conventional physics. Yet this legitimate scientific phenomenon had become distorted through decades of secretive operation, institutional arrogance, and ultimately, criminal suppression of accidental discoveries. As the reception concluded, the state attorney general approached the tourist with an update on the ongoing investigation. The federal grand jury has returned indictments against 17 individuals associated with the Blackwater operation, she reported. Charges range from misappropriation of government resources to criminal conspiracy and, in 3 cases, homicide related to the suppression activities. The prosecution will likely continue for years given the complexity and classified aspects of the evidence. And the silver-haired couple who attempted to return me to the facility? The tourist inquired. Apprehended yesterday in a bordering state, the Attorney General confirmed. They've been operating as independent contractors for the program since officially retiring from government service in 1989. Their role focused specifically on containing accidental exposures, precisely what they attempted with you. This news provided a measure of personal closure, though the tourist recognized that the full institutional accounting remained in early stages. The mechanisms that had allowed an unauthorized research program to operate for decades, harming citizens who encountered it while consuming unappropriated resources, represented systemic failures requiring structural reform rather than merely individual prosecution. The most important outcome, the tourist observed, is ensuring this pattern cannot repeat elsewhere. The temptation to classify and conceal unusual discoveries will always exist, but the oversight mechanisms must be robust enough to prevent operational independence from evolving into unaccountable fiefdoms. The Attorney General nodded agreement. That's precisely why the congressional investigations extend beyond this specific program to examine classification protocols and oversight mechanisms across all sensitive research operations. Your exposure of Blackwater Valley has catalyzed reform discussions that have been needed for decades. As the formal recognition events concluded, the tourist found himself experiencing the complex emotional aftermath that often follows whistleblowing of this magnitude. The public validation affirmed his decision to pursue exposure despite the personal risks involved, yet the human cost of the operation's decades-long suppression activities left little sense of triumph. What remained was the somber satisfaction of having fulfilled a civic responsibility, of having ensured that truth eventually overcame institutional concealment, regardless of the powerful interests invested in maintaining secrecy. 6 months after his discovery of the cabin, the tourist sat at his familiar desk in the marketing firm's headquarters, reviewing quarterly projection reports with his operations director. The rhythm of corporate life had resumed. Client meetings, strategy sessions, team management, yet something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with this once all-consuming professional world. The Anderson account projections look solid, he observed, though we should adjust the digital allocation given the platform changes announced last week. The operations director nodded agreement, making necessary notations. Their professional partnership had deepened, following her critical role in the contingency protocols that helped ensure his evidence reached appropriate channels. Without her prompt action when receiving his emergency notification, the documentation might have faced much greater suppression challenges. "The board has approved your reduced schedule," she mentioned as their meeting concluded. 4 days weekly, with flexibility for the ongoing legal consultations. They're actually quite pleased with the arrangement, given the positive publicity associations. The tourist acknowledged this accommodation with appreciation. The continuing investigations, congressional testimony, Justice Department consultations, scientific documentation, required regular time commitments that a standard corporate schedule couldn't accommodate. More fundamentally, his perspective on work-life balance had undergone permanent recalibration following his confrontation with both institutional corruption and scientific phenomena that challenged basic assumptions about reality. His colleagues had adjusted to his newfound public recognition, the occasional media presence outside the building, and the subtle shift in his approach to corporate challenges. What once seemed critically important, market share fluctuations, competitor positioning, quarterly targets, now existed within a broader context of significance. The tourist performed his professional responsibilities with unchanged competence but diminished intensity, having glimpsed matters of considerably greater consequence. When the operations director departed, the tourist remained at his desk, opening a secure digital folder containing updates from the ongoing Blackwater Valley investigation. The scientific documentation had progressed substantially, with research teams now studying the temporal anomalies under transparent protocols with appropriate safety measures. 3 peer-reviewed papers had already been published, with dozens more in development, as the scientific community grappled with phenomena that challenged existing theoretical frameworks. The legal proceedings advanced simultaneously, with 5 former program officials having accepted plea agreements in exchange for cooperation with the broader investigation. Their testimony had revealed the progressive evolution of the program from legitimate research into increasingly unauthorized operation, documenting how institutional momentum and secrecy requirements had eventually superseded both legal authorization and ethical constraints. Most personally significant were the recovery updates from previous victims of the program's suppression activities. The wildlife photographer had regained consciousness and begun physical rehabilitation, though his recovery would require years of continued therapy. Families of those who had suffered career destruction following encounters with the facility had received formal government acknowledgement and compensation processes. Those whose loved ones had died in orchestrated accidents now pursued both criminal justice and civil remedies with the full support of government investigators. The tourist closed the digital folder and gazed through his office window at the city skyline beyond. His annual wilderness sabbatical, interrupted so dramatically by the cabin discovery, had traditionally served as escape from corporate intensity. Now, a different purpose called him back to the mountains, not for escape but for completion. 2 days later, the tourist stood at the formally established perimeter surrounding Blackwater Valley. The restricted zone signage remained, but with critical differences: transparent explanations of the ongoing scientific research, legitimate government agency identification, and proper authorization processes for those with research or official business. What had operated for decades through deception and intimidation now functioned under appropriate oversight and public accountability. The lead site researcher, a physicist with both academic credentials and security clearance, accompanied the tourist along the designated observation path. "We've established continuous monitoring stations at 37 coordinates throughout the valley," she explained, pointing toward discreetly positioned equipment. Each captures baseline measurements of the temporal variance effects, creating the first comprehensive mapping of naturally occurring space-time irregularities. The cabin itself remained visible in the distance, though now surrounded by proper research infrastructure rather than concealed surveillance equipment. The simple log structure that had concealed decades of unauthorized experimentation had been preserved as both historical artifact and central research focus, its significance now acknowledged through proper documentation rather than institutional secrecy. "The photographic display has been preserved exactly as you discovered it," the researcher explained as they observed from the designated viewpoint. "It represents both evidence in the ongoing investigation and invaluable documentation of the anomaly's visual manifestation across time periods. The scientific community remains particularly interested in the apparent causality questions raised by your appearance in images before your actual visit. The tourist absorbed this information while processing his emotional response to returning to the site. 6 months of investigation, exposure, and institutional response had transformed the context entirely, yet the fundamental strangeness of what he had discovered remained. The cabin still represented a window into aspects of reality that defied conventional understanding, now studied openly rather than exploited in secrecy. The underground facility has been completely reconfigured, the researcher continued, gesturing toward what appeared to be a modern research station adjacent to the original cabin. All experimental equipment has been documented, much of it decommissioned due to safety concerns. The remaining technology is being studied by a joint scientific intelligence community task force to determine appropriate applications under proper oversight. After completing the formal tour, the researcher allowed the tourist a moment of private reflection at the valley overlook, the same ridgeline where he had first observed the cabin during his initial hike. From this elevation, the transformation was visually apparent. What had operated through concealment and deception now functioned in transparency. The valley's unique properties studied through legitimate scientific protocols, rather than unauthorized experimentation. Standing alone at this vantage point, the tourist experienced not triumph, but something more nuanced, a tempered satisfaction that truth had eventually emerged, despite powerful interests invested in its suppression. The cabin and its impossible photographs had frozen him in horror upon discovery, yet that moment of shock had initiated a process through which institutional accountability had eventually prevailed over secrecy and suppression. The fundamental mysteries remained. Scientific papers now discussed localized temporal variance fields and nonlinear chronological progression, yet these technical terms merely formalized rather than fully explained the valley's strange properties. The cabin still contained photographs spanning impossible chronological ranges. The tourist's own image still appeared in a photograph taken before his actual visit, a causality paradox now studied by physicists rather than concealed by government operatives. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Blackwater Valley, the tourist descended from the overlook to rejoin the research team below. The answers might remain incomplete, the full implications of the temporal anomalies still beyond current scientific understanding, but the methodology had fundamentally changed. What once progressed through secrecy, suppression, and unaccountable operation now advanced through transparency, oversight, and ethical constraints. For the tourist, this transformation represented the most meaningful outcome of his accidental discovery, not the scientific revelations or personal recognition, but the restoration of proper process in confronting the unknown. The tourist descended the path toward the valley floor, leaving behind the ridgeline where his journey had begun 6 months earlier with what should have been a simple wilderness hike. 1 year to the day after first encountering the cabin, the tourist stood once again at the trailhead where his journey had begun. The morning air carried that distinctive Rocky Mountain crispness, sharp enough to jolt the senses, yet somehow soothing in its purity. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold as the first rays of sunlight crested the jagged peaks. Unlike that first morning, he now understood what waited in the valley beyond. Not merely a mysteriously abandoned cabin, but a window into fundamental questions about the nature of time itself. The research station operated with full authorization, transparent protocols, and proper oversight. The victims of previous suppression activities had received acknowledgement and justice. The institutional failures had been exposed and reforms implemented. Yet some mysteries remained fundamentally unresolved. The scientists now properly studying the temporal anomalies had formally documented their effects without fully explaining their cause. The photographic phenomenon, images capturing moments across different time periods, had been verified without being completely understood. The tourist's own appearance in photographs before his actual visit remained a causality paradox that challenged conventional physics. As he prepared for this commemorative hike, the tourist reflected on what his discovery had ultimately revealed. Beyond the specific scientific phenomena, beyond the institutional corruption, lay a more fundamental truth about human interaction with the unknown. When confronted with phenomena that challenge existing understanding, the path forward lies not through concealment, but through transparent inquiry. not through suppression, but through ethical investigation. The tourist adjusted his backpack, containing water, trail mix, compass, and camera, just as it had 1 year earlier, and began walking the now familiar path. The valley waited beyond, its strange properties now acknowledged rather than concealed, its mysteries approached through legitimate inquiry rather than secretive exploitation. What had frozen him in horror upon discovery had ultimately led toward greater understanding, both of natural phenomena and of institutional accountability. The truth, once exposed, had initiated its own momentum, scientific, legal, and ethical processes that continued independent of any individual's actions. The tourist had merely opened a door that powerful interests had worked decades to keep closed. What emerged through that doorway now belonged to collective human knowledge rather than sequestered government operation. As the tourist crested the first ridge, the morning sun fully illuminated the valley beyond, including the cabin that had changed his understanding of reality itself, the photograph that had once frozen him in horror. His own image captured before his actual visit had initiated a journey beyond mere whistleblowing into fundamental questions about time, causality, and the limits of current scientific understanding. Some truths, once glimpsed, transform not just circumstances but perception itself. The tourist continued along the trail, moving toward rather than away from the mysteries that waited in Blackwater Valley. Thanks for experiencing this 4-part investigative thriller. If you enjoyed this story about the tourist who accidentally found an abandoned cabin in the Colorado mountains and froze in horror at what he discovered inside, don't forget to subscribe for more immersive storytelling experiences. Remember that sometimes the most profound discoveries happen when we venture off the marked trails of conventional understanding.